Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have been asked to lead, if that's the right word, this conversation about a subject close to my heart in poetry. We don't need to be modest about poetry after all. This is not humdrum work that we are doing. For many of us, it is the most elevated form of literature. So I don't intend to be coy or indeed uncritical about it. Firstly, so that before I find out a bit about you as a group, some information about me, and you've heard a little about my work. I began as a bookseller. I joined a great academic publisher as a marketing manager. I then became a publisher at Oxford University Press. I worked on a lot of great reference projects, in particular throughout the 1990s. And along the way began to publish poetry. After I left OUP in 2000, I had a sabbatical, my 1 year off in 30 years. What a nice prospect and a second year off would be. I wonder if anyone will ever give it to me. And I wrote a family memoir, unexpectedly. I never thought to write non-fiction or fiction really at that stage. A book called Rose Boys about something that happened to my family. And soon after that, I became editor of Australian Book Review, and I'm still at it. Rose Boys, for those of you who know it, is, I think, a good example of the way in which that form, it's a trade book in family memoir, can nonetheless incorporate some of the qualities of poetry, and indeed incorporate poetry. I use it in, as many memoirists do now. I draw on earlier poetry. I use it in different forms. The memoir too, just like the poem, is a very plastic form, and my background, my lifelong work really, I see myself as a poet, not as any other kind of writer, informed that work, and I think made it, I hope, a little different from other family memoirs of that kind about particular forms of disability and difficulty. I began, as I say, as a poet, and that's what I continue to do. It was a formative kind of epiphany I had at school, helped by an astute teacher. But afterwards, it became a particularly long kind of grinding apprenticeship with years of rejection, and for very good reason too, I might say. I seem to recall about 20 putting together a poetry manuscript in a great hurry, as you are when you're 20 or 22 or whatever I was, and sent it off to Angus and Robertson. And when I came to publish my first book years later, it was rejected. My first book many years later, not one of those original poems survived. They all went in the bin. Looking back now, I kind of almost marvel that I persisted, because I was particularly isolated. I wasn't working in the literary scene at all, not remotely, a fairly isolated person, but persist I somehow did. I published my first poem in a magazine at the age of 30, and I published my first book of poems at the age of 35, and I published a few since then. I've had two careers, as I say, for various reasons, and and I think it exemplifies the fact that one can combine all sorts of careers with literature and poetry. Poetry in particular, I think, which doesn't need those enormous blocks of time that a novel does. During my 13 years as editor of ABR, I've published seven books, and I intend to do more. So, obviously, professional careers, busy though you are, certainly don't preclude writing lots and lots of poetry. I think it's really important, and for younger poets and poets in the early years as they work towards a volume or the second volume. That notion of writing poetry as a discipline and breaking down any sense of poetry as a hobby or as a religious calling, if you like, where one must wait for a Keatsian inspiration to hover and then descend. My approach has been very different, even though I do have a bit like Tony. I mean, awe of the body of work that we inherit, and consider myself extremely fortunate to be able to, try to contribute to that body of work in some small way. I think it's very important to get used to writing a lot of poetry, and writing a lot of poetry or revising a lot of poetry, even when you're not in the mood, and not to wait for those epiphanies, those romantic stirrings, and if a new poem doesn't occur to you, to proceed with earlier works, because I think, from my point of view, it's when you're living inside the language. It's a strange sort of notion. When you're getting somehow close to poetry, when that you sort of unleash that language, vocabulary, rhythms in your head, that you're much likely to get new ones. Whereas if you just wait for the inspiration, find excuses not to do it, and that for me is, and I think for probably, if I'm honest, for a lot of poets in middle age or older, it gets harder as if you're called away on other forms of work. And I find those periods I have a real sense of estrangement from poetry at times now, which would have been inconceivable when I was young. And as a result, it just doesn't happen as often. Perhaps one isn't as impatient later on. But certainly I really recommend that intensive writing and revision. Certainly when I was starting out, I found it very helpful to start at a particular time, at a regular time, and concentrate. And if I could, and I don't know about you, but I find it amazing how much poetry you can get done over a period of a month or a year if you regularly incorporate 2 or 3 hour poetry sessions in your life. That's to me the blessed condition for a poet, and then I think that's the way. Shorter bursts than that can work and have to work if you're preoccupied, but don't, I think, provide that impulse, that sort of imaginative impulse that I was talking about. And I think people generally now work harder, work longer hours, more, and staring at computers, which is not very congenial and makes it a bit harder. But during those years when I was working part-time in bookshops and in publishing and writing tons of poems, I would start out every morning, I can't believe I did this, but start out reading poetry for 2 hours. I'd get up and have breakfast and I'd read poetry. Imagine doing that now. Why did I stop? It's just beautiful. Each day I would take down 2 different poets and just read and read and read and read them aloud too. That becomes more difficult, doesn't it? But it's fantastic. And I was impressed last year when I was at the Prime Minister's Literary Awards in Queensland, and Tony Burke, the outgoing minister who was presenting the awards, said that he started each day reading poetry for an hour. And I thought, the last such politician to do so. But a fantastic Philip. I can't imagine really writing poetry and not reading a great deal of better poetry in tandem with it. I think that would be, I can't imagine doing that. It would be just, to me, the two are absolutely complementary and necessary. So if you can find that time, obviously it's wonderfully beneficial, advantageous to the work itself. As for mine is just one working method, but Writers Victoria invited me here, so you may as well how I approach the business. It's a very gradual grafting approach to poetry, unlike fiction, where I write very quickly, very decisively. My last novel, Roddy Parr, I wrote 120,000 words in 8 months from 10 p.m. to 1 or 2 or 3 every day of the week, or as many days as I could, and I wrote it very quickly. That's a different part, seems to be a different part of my imagination, and my poetry is very, very difficult, because for me there are seem to be two different kinds of poets. Those poets who can sit down at their desk and say, right, today I will write about a poem on this subject, or I will write a sonnet. It's a while since I've written a sonnet, or that, and do it. Intellectual poets, academic poets, wonderful professional poets. I'm not remotely like that. I've never ever written a poem sitting at a desk. I wish I could. It'd be so much more convenient. The poetry for me comes elsewhere. It comes often extremely inconveniently, on the beach, in a concert, in a gallery, in a reverie, at a party. That's where the germ of the poem happens to me. I think of my first drafts as mere artist sketches now. I've got used to the crudity of my first drafts, it's important just to get a few phrases down, a sense of what this mood, this thing, this reverie that descends in a way on page, and not to feel embarrassed by the sheer crudity. Then I take it back to my desk, and thus begins the hard grinding process of editorial revision. Often that particular work doesn't start for weeks or months or even years. It's quite usual for me to finish a poem 6 months or 6 years after that first draft. Very often I have forgotten the first draft, forgotten about it through some happy discoveries I come along, and I think, oh, there's a poem in there. And if I can somehow summon up some sense of that state, that mood, that emotion, then it's okay. It is revivable, even over those periods. But that's an unusual technique, and it may say something about my capacity for procrastination, I suppose, really. Most of my poems would go to half a dozen drafts. Some longer, more difficult poems to maybe 10 or 20. Sometimes I will revise a poem over a couple of years. That's the way it is. Usually the poems tend to lengthen during that process of revision, often doubling in length. That's just the way I am. So I try to curb that, but I go on making it more elaborate, I suppose, trying to curb it but adding to it, and partly because of the smallness of that original artist sketch, as I touched on it. For me, one thing I always advise, doesn't work for everyone, but advise poets, and again, particularly, I'm addressing a lot of this to those of you who may be working towards a first book or still at the early stages of a career. Again, to try to obviate that over-reliance on romantic sort of destiny or calling, is to have at least half a dozen drafts available on the go. at any one time. If you get one of those blocks of time, I found it an extremely good way just to move through half a dozen of them sequentially in those mornings, those blessed mornings when you're alone with poetry. Move them forward, bump them forward a bit, always by sounding the poems, reading and reading and reading them aloud. I can't imagine just doing that on the page. You've got to hear what's going on. And then when you reach a point where you know it's not finished, but it's closer, move on to the next one. May seem quite factory-like, robotic, but it's not. I think, and then I'll have another poem. It's good to ward off any sense of frustration. If you hit a wall in a poem, you go on to the next one. And you take that forward, take in those changes, type it off, put it in your folder, move on to the next one. That for me was a very useful way. And almost inevitably in those sessions I would finish a poem, which is a nice feeling, always a nice feeling, and very often that intensive work inside language, and that's how I think of it, work being inside language, would prompt a new poem, and I would find myself getting an idea for another one. So it's quite a progressive approach to the poetry, and also I think it accustoms us to thinking about working in a more professional way, incorporating poetry into our lives, not just in as a form of recreation, but as an intrinsic part of one's work. I've just talked about the work for me being overwhelmingly an oral business. I become more conscious of that now as I get older, and for me the music, the sound of the poem, one hopes it has musical qualities, the rhythm, cadences, are more important to me than the subject matter, and that sense informs my work, and it is I have a stronger sense of that now, and the primary event, the spur, the poignant memory, the emotion, the public absurdity that leads you to write a satire about someone or something, these are just springboards, and it's the music, these musical entities, as I think we need to think of that, and thus overcoming that any dreary or pervasive sense that poetry is a kind of message sending, like a kind of lecture or sermon or exhortation. I don't think that good poetry needs to mean much at all. Whatever means, if you know what I mean. It's better sometimes if the meaning is latent, opaque, difficult. What does matter is what saves a poem and makes it necessary to other people, which is why we do it, isn't it? Is the technical accomplishment and the musical form. Often meaning has a secondary role. At first, when I was younger, I would suspect domestic subject matter as being inferior or unworthy or a bit unpoetic, really. But now, 30 years after starting out on poetry, I almost relish the most modest of subjects, often occurring in the most unlikely ways, as I say, walking in a park, walking in a beach, in a concert. Sometimes you find yourself writing a poem seemingly about nothing, the something only becomes apparent later. The garland of associations, as I call it, needed if a poem is to transcend its contingencies. Ultimately, the poem must become larger than you, much larger, without becoming grandiose. 20 years ago, when I wrote a not unrelated poem called Vantage, a St Kilda poem, I was living in a block of flats. Again, one morning had gone out to hang out some washing. The last thing I had in mind was to write a poem. Last thing. It was deeply inconvenient when it occurred. But then the sight of a woman in the block of flats behind my tenement fired the poem. Hanging out the stained tablecloth and several monogrammed handkerchiefs that once belonged to my father, I look up. It is a high, wild, imperious, handsome day. I had it to myself for an hour like an ambivalent character in Conrad, nautical man alone with his dyspathy. Now looking round me, I confront a universe like an empirical zoo, everyone watching. A stunned young man washing up in his hungover way. A calico cat wedged in its tree, patient for doves. That elderly Russian woman leaning from her window, drying her grey magisterial hair. Staring, just staring, everybody staring. Or is this egoism, morning's fine way of mocking an unshaved transcendentalist? Today I feel like greeting each of them singly, as saying some ludicrous summary gesture. Though when I venture good morning, the Russian woman goes on staring, her mannish mouth ambiguously grave. Conceivably deaf, incontestably beautiful, this was someone's Beatrice, leaning now from her window in a suburb thousands of miles from the known and the ardent. What is it you would have me say? She insinuates, unravelling her grey magisterial hair, while I stroke the belled calico cat, admire the Republic of Verdure canopying our shared courtyard. Last night it was a refuge for insolent possums, maddening my neighbour's Airedale, forcing an early waking not unwelcome. Again I greet my ironic Russian, sternest of sharers. Again, no answer. Yes, it is a high, wild, imperious, handsome day. Upstairs, my espresso pot has long boiled dry. The companionable stock flavours the flat with rosemary and celery and thyme. In a blind room at the end of the hall, a tender guest, laziest of celebrants, wakens in my bed, traces the knots and fjords of my absence, calling. I think that writing a poem shouldn't be an act of direct autobiographical self-expression. We have diaries for that, memoirs, and now we have Facebook and therapy. Poetry does something else, or should do something else. Poems that fail or aren't encouraged by the poet to disentangle themselves from the direct biographical burden never fully take off. And we are not, after all, on oath when we write poems. Quite the opposite. We are mythologizing our experience, aren't we? We are donning masks. Thomas Mann. Who is the poet? He whose life is symbolic. Or Emily Dickinson. Tell the truth, but tell it slant. It's probably the most naked expression of the poetic art. And W.B. Yeats went further. Poets should be good liars. It is an awkward business, isn't it? Sometimes feeding off those emotions and turning them into this work of art that is intended to entertain, but necessary and unavoidable. I think very hard to create a serious body of poetry without doing that. Love poetry, similarly, I imagine all of you have written love poems. Who could not? It's the ultimate form of poetry, but not without hazards, as we know. And here, I think particularly emotional explicitness can be cringe-makingly embarrassing and dangerous. G.K. Chesterton on Robert Browning: "It is the truest of all love poetry because it does not speak much about love." I do think it is extremely important to listen to the poem. I'm surprised sometimes when I talk to poets, older or younger, who do not actually recite the poems as they work on them and complete them. That I can't imagine doing. To me, it seems to be huge advantages. What the ear will pick up that the mind may miss on the page. Listen to it over and over again, and the flaws in it will inevitably become apparent to you if you've got a good ear, if your ear is in. I wouldn't bother too early reading it out, trying it out on other people. You're in charge, and really keep playing it over and over again. And I find during those sessions, when I might have 2 or 3 hours, I just sit there, God knows what the neighbours think, but just reading it over and over, and that couplet that does not work for some reason because it's got a broken little cog in it, just doing it until finally you get the knack. You discover the flaw in it. And here I think it's very close to a musical technique. The pianist, after all, doesn't go on stage to perform a recital without hours and hours and hours of practice. And those rhythms and cadences are only fully working if we have listened to them over and over again. I think it's very important to, I'm not very good at it, but I'm sure it's important to learn to part with parts of the poem. We become, I think, overly attached. There's a clever image, or if you're writing a satire, as I do, you particularly, an interesting snideness about some absurdity of the literary world that you want to keep in there. But the poems are these musical forms, and you don't want to overload the poems. And I think it's very good to. It's something liberating about putting a line through half a dozen good poems that retard that particular poem. The editor and publisher in me feels obliged to talk a bit about the sordid act of publication. Emily Dickinson, who only published 7 of those 1,500 poems, as we know, started one poem. Publication is the auction of the mind, and it is a bit of an auction. But this is why we are here, and this is the aspiration of most poets. I always speak with groups of younger poets about the absolute importance of perseverance, particularly in the early years, and when you're trying to put together enough poems to publish a book of poems. Sending out. Always good at the outset to have, say, half a dozen bundles of poems out there with the journals. And one tip, not that it helped me very greatly in my first decade as a poet, but when the rejections were coming in steadily, was that every time I got a rejection note from a magazine or a newspaper, I promptly put together another bundle and went straight out to a found letterbox and got one more in circulation. This was my little puny protest here. I'm keeping at it. Because particularly I think when you're putting together that portfolio, it can be a demoralising business. And we know that until poets have, when poets have begun to appear here and there in newspapers, magazines, then it gets easier. There's recognition factor. Editors are human after all. I always counsel beginning poets to familiarise themselves with the publishing scene. For poets, to get to know the periodicals. There are a number of them. They're always springing up. As some die, more are created. There are new online possibilities now, not always paying ones, but sometimes offering a kind of circulation that the periodicals cannot possibly provide. We have writers' centres, we have festivals where you can get to know the individual players. I think it's very sensible for would-be writers, beginning writers, to get to know not just the periodicals, but get to know who the influential poetry editors and literary editors are. Really peruse the magazines. Support them too. Be good literary citizens. Subscribe to them. It does help. It shouldn't help, but it does help. I think we're all aware of the people who support the endeavours and help to keep it all going. It's an act of generosity. I think that can have many rewards. Obviously, every magazine has its own different tenor, style, direction. ABR is very different from Overland, very different from Meanjin, and very different from the Monthly, and so it should be. We're all have our distinctive path. It's very sensible to get to know, to choose the magazine that you really, what's the magazine that really suits you? Think of it selfishly. Where would you like to, where do you belong? And then set about really cracking it. And that I think is the most heartening thing early on, when you appear in that magazine that you really admire. That's I think it is a lonely and unremunerative business being a poet in this country. We don't do it for remuneration or laurels, but it is an isolated business, and that act of publication in places that matter is a great incentive to keep going. My last bit of advice, particularly to younger poets, is to be realistic at the outset and not to be too impatient to publish, not to be too impatient to publish as I was, as I mentioned, that first book, that first manuscript when I was 20, ill-formed and unready. Bide your time. You will know when the work is ready, and it's much better when you look back on a first book that isn't a complete embarrassment to you. There are lots of places around where you can publish. The magazine that I edit is one of them. Australian Book Review has a big commitment to poetry, not just reviewing the poetry. I added the publication of new poetry to it when I became editor, not because I'm a poet, but because I thought poetry belongs in any literary review. We publish about half a dozen poems in most issues if we can. We pay $250 per poem, which is a lot more than anyone else is paying, I believe. Lisa Gorton, fine young Melbourne poet, is my poetry editor. Easy way to just go to our website to find out how to submit poems. Electronic submission, as with most publications nowadays, is possible. We also run the Peter Porter Poetry Prize, the most alliterative literary prize in the world, every year. And now will be in its 10th year, I think. That's worth $5,000. So there was a golden decade or so in recent years when a few major houses began to publish poetry. My first book, The House of Vitriol, in 1990, was part of a new series of Picador poets. That was a great opportunity for a first-timer. Picador, then Penguin, others withdrew from the game. But it seems to me to have been filled up, that void filled by ever more enterprising small houses, many in Sydney, some here, and I think there are probably the number of chapbooks and slim volumes has increased over the years. I think there are lots of ways of being published, and then there are all the online opportunities. I think it's something of a, certainly for me in terms of the range of good Australian poets, good to extremely good now, is enviable and almost a wonderment for a country with our population. It seems to me that there are fantastic possibilities and voices in poetry. What is the problem is that there is no audience for the stuff. That's the real issue. And not even the poets themselves really support the poetry. We know that from the sales. If you publish a book of poetry now, you know from your royalty statement, the unit sales. It's just something has happened. That's the real challenge, because I think there can be a little voice in the back of your head when you do this stuff, commit a lifetime really to this stuff, and you think, why is there so little connection now? Why are people so timorous about poetry? How can you live without poetry in your life? That to me would be, and yet they do. And for contemporary poetry, I think the circulation is really small. I'm pleased that the newspapers have, after a period of reviewing very little of the stuff, have moved back a bit. I think there's a little more of it being reviewed. The Age now will publish 2 poems a week instead of 1. The Weekend Australian's pretty good. We're doing our bit. The magazines go on. But it's the matter of how you get the poetry out there, how you reach an audience. Not everyone wants to go along. Not everyone wants to do open readings. Not everyone wants to fill their bootload with books and sell up like a carpetbagger. But really, it's often left to the poet to be the salesman, the retailer. But there are lots of opportunities for this, but not all paying opportunities. And I'm enough of a publisher to worry about the speed with which Australian writers are almost giving away the expectation of payment by their willingness to publish for no payment. I think it's an act of great altruism and generosity, but it does have some risks. It does accustom the world to that idea that writing is a hobby, and that publication should suffice, and that the artist is not entitled to payment. This is a problem in all the art forms, and I do encourage people to if you see your writing as a professional extension of your life, then you're entitled to payment. As for fashions, I think the serial poem is becoming quite interesting. I'm working on it at one level. Jennifer Maiden, really one of our most influential and successful poets, this flamboyant new vein of poems where she writes about political figures, Rudd, Hillary, Rodham, Clinton, and animating them in satirical and brilliant ways, all these sort of narrative poems, provide a model that I see more of that work coming through at the magazine. So I think it's an incredibly rich period in poetry. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is just connecting, taking the poetry beyond this congenial gathering and interesting the people out there who, by and large, and I don't think it's an exaggeration, entirely live without poetry. And that's the real challenge for writers at present. So, thank you very much.